I'll open with a dark, emotionally charged first scene, one that immediately throws the viewer into the humiliation, betrayal, and slow-burning revenge at the heart of the story. Then I'll weave in a natural, haunting CTA, something like, if silence has ever burned inside you, stay till the end. The wedding was meant to be the proudest day of his life, the day a father watched his only son step into his own future. But as the violins played and the chatter of champagne-soaked laughter filled the air, Harold sat alone, invisible in a sea of luxury. The venue was a castle of white marble and gold, the kind of place that smelled of wealth and polished hypocrisy. Chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars, and every guest dressed as if the night were a coronation. Yet, for all its splendor, there was a hollowness in it, a cold, performative joy that Harold could feel even from the back row. He wasn't seated among family. He wasn't even near the aisle. The bride's side had seen to that. Just logistics, his son had said awkwardly when the seating chart was revealed. It's a small space, Dad. You understand, right? Harold had nodded. He always nodded. That was his role, quiet, agreeable, invisible. He wore his best suit, though it was old. A simple navy one, tailored decades ago when his wife was still alive and pride still meant something. He'd even polished his shoes until he could see his reflection, not because anyone would notice, but because he wanted his late wife to be proud, wherever she was. And yet, as the ceremony began, the ache in his chest wasn't nostalgia. It was something darker. When the bride, Amelia, walked down the aisle, her beauty drew gasps. Every camera turned toward her, every head bowed in admiration. Harold watched his son's eyes shine with love and naive devotion, and for a moment he wanted to feel happy. But then, Amelia's gaze flickered to him, sharp, dismissive, cruel. Her smile faltered into something small, private, and venomous. And that was when Harold understood, this wasn't his day. It never was. It had begun long before the wedding, in subtle ways. The first time he met her, she'd arrived at his modest home in heels that cost more than his monthly pension. She had walked through his living room, the one his wife had filled with warm browns and family photos, as though it were a museum of the poor. "Oh," she'd said, glancing around. "It's quaint." Harold had smiled politely. "Built it myself, back in the day." Her laugh had been light but sharp. "You mean literally?" He'd nodded. "Yes. I was a carpenter before I retired." She'd raised a brow, as though the word carpenter were foreign. "That's interesting." She'd never looked at him the same way after that. And over time, her contempt spread, like rot. When she hosted dinners, she'd mock him in front of others. "Careful, don't let Harold near the wine glasses," she'd say with a smirk. "He might try to whittle them into something." The guests would laugh politely, uncertain whether they should. His son would frown but never defend him. He'd just place a hand on her shoulder and mutter, "Amelia, stop." But she never did. Because she didn't need to. Harold never spoke back. He never shouted. He simply sat, listened, and observed. And because of that, she mistook him for weak. The day before the wedding, he had been asked, not invited, to come by the rehearsal. When he arrived, Amelia was giving orders like a general in silk. Her father, a tall, red-faced man with a permanent smirk, watched with approval. The staff moved quickly under her gaze, terrified to displease. When Harold approached, her expression tightened. "Oh," she said flatly, "you made it." He smiled faintly. "Wouldn't miss it." "Well, just so you know," she said, arms folded, "tomorrow's event is going to be very formal. The photographers are extremely particular about the guest shots, so if you could just keep to the side during the main ceremony, that would be great." Her tone was honeyed, but the sting beneath it was clear. Her father chuckled. "Don't worry, old man. They'll still catch a few shots of you. Background filler, right?" They laughed. Harold didn't. He looked around at the florists, the planners, the glittering stage, and he saw what his son had traded his mother's values for. Wealth. Appearances. A family that looked down on everything she had stood for. He left quietly before rehearsal ended. That night, alone in his small apartment, he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, old documents, signatures, and one very specific piece of paper. A prenuptial agreement. Drafted a year ago, when his son had first announced his engagement. Harold had insisted on it. At the time, his son had rolled his eyes. "Dad, it's not necessary. I love her." And Harold had simply said, "Love her all you want. But never forget, you built nothing she values." Protect what you've earned. His son had reluctantly agreed, and Harold had helped him draw it up, quietly, thoroughly, with clauses so airtight they could strangle an empire. But Amelia had never read it. Not properly. She'd signed it with a flourish and a smug comment about legal formalities. And that was when Harold knew, someday, that paper would matter. At the wedding, the ceremony concluded in perfection. The applause was thunderous. The bride and groom kissed beneath a cascade of petals and lights. Then came the reception, an exhibition of wealth and arrogance. Champagne towers, orchestras, tables heavy with gold-trimmed menus. Harold found his seat at the far edge of the hall, near the catering entrance, where the hum of industrial fans drowned out conversation. He didn't mind. He watched, detached, as Amelia laughed too loudly and posed for photos, draped in jewels she hadn't paid for. He saw her whisper into her father's ear, both glancing his way. Then, when it came time for toasts, she stood with her glass raised and her cruelty dressed in charm. "I just want to thank everyone for being here," she began, her voice ringing through the hall. "And of course, to my new husband's family, especially his father, Harold. He couldn't be here for most of the preparations, but, well, he's done his part, I suppose." The guests laughed softly, uncertain but obedient. Her father snorted. "Yeah, thanks for the old-school values, her." She giggled. "Exactly." Harold's son looked down at his drink, shame painting his face. The orchestra struck up a tune, and the humiliation melted into noise. But for Harold, it didn't fade. It crystallized. He stood quietly, adjusted his tie, and left the hall. He didn't make a scene. He didn't say a word. But as he walked into the cold night, something in him shifted. Because humiliation, in men like him, doesn't break. It sharpens. In the weeks that followed, the cracks began to show. Amelia's new life, the one built on appearances, came with expectations she hadn't anticipated. The house she wanted. The renovations. The endless parties. Her father's money covered much of it. But not all. And when she tried to dip into her husband's assets, she found doors locked. Bank accounts she couldn't access. Property deeds she couldn't touch. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Until she read the prenup again. And this time, really read it. Her laughter turned to panic. Every clause. Every loophole. Every protection her father-in-law had woven into that document, all of it was there. She would leave with nothing if she ever disrespected, defamed, or acted in hostility toward her husband's family. It was written in black and white. Signed. Witnessed. And filed by Harold himself. That night, she sat at the dining table, shaking, the paper trembling in her manicured hands. Her husband watched quietly. "You didn't read it, did you?" She looked up, pale. "Your father wrote this." He nodded. He said love was trust. But contracts were clarity. She swallowed hard. "This is insane." "No," he said softly. "This is my father." Far away, in his modest home, Harold sat by the window again, a faint smile on his lips. He didn't seek applause. He didn't need revenge served loud. He'd already written it. In ink. In foresight. In silence. There's a quiet power in paperwork. Most people don't see it. They think revenge comes with fire, shouting, or blood. But for Harold, it came with fine print, the kind you don't notice until the flames are already licking at your feet. While Amelia paraded through her honeymoon, blind in luxury and entitlement, Harold was already moving pieces she didn't even know existed. He was a man who had spent 40 years working with his hands, but it wasn't just wood he understood, it was people. The patterns of pride, the small ways greed reveals itself, the certainty that arrogance never reads the details. The prenuptial agreement wasn't an act of protection anymore. It was a chessboard, and every signature had been a move. Months before the wedding, Harold had sat in a quiet corner of his lawyer's office, the air thick with old books and sharper minds. His attorney, Martin Dales, was a grizzled man with eyes that had seen too many marriages rot from the inside. "You sure about this?" Martin asked, peering over the stack of drafted papers. "You're not just protecting your son. You're practically locking her out of every door." Harold's hands were steady. "I'm protecting his future. And mine." Martin nodded slowly. "She won't read it." "I know. She'll sign it." "She likes the idea of being smart more than the reality of it," Harold said quietly. "She'll see paper, not power." So together they built something meticulous, a legal fortress disguised as love's formality. Clause by clause, Harold added not just protection, but accountability. It wasn't cruelty, it was discipline. If the bride showed public hostility toward the groom's family, she forfeited all rights to marital property. If she attempted to liquidate or sell family assets without mutual consent, she forfeited future inheritance. If she filed for divorce within 5 years, the duration Harold predicted her patience would last, she'd leave with nothing. But the final clause was the one that mattered most. The reputation and conduct clause. If she ever acted in a way that publicly humiliated or defamed the family, including her father-in-law, the marriage trust would dissolve immediately. Her father, smug and overconfident, had reviewed the document briefly, scanning with the carelessness of wealth. Standard stuff, he'd said, signing his witness statement with a flourish. Harold had shaken his hand, polite and steady. "Pleasure doing business with you, sir." The man had laughed. "You sound like one of us, old man." Harold smiled. "You have no idea." Now, sitting months after the wedding, Harold could almost hear the echoes of that handshake, a deal sealed in arrogance. He wasn't cruel. He hadn't built the trap out of malice. He'd built it because he understood that people like Amelia didn't learn through kindness. They learned through consequence. She had taken his silence for surrender, and he had let her. Because silence, in the hands of a wise man, is just patience wearing a disguise. Amelia's unraveling began quietly. At first, it was little things, declined transactions, account locks, legal notices that she didn't understand. Her emails to her father grew sharper by the day. "Why can't I access our joint savings?" she demanded one night. Ryan, her husband, barely looked up from the couch. "Because it's not joint." She froze. "What?" "The prenup divides everything. You have your account. I have mine." "That's ridiculous. We're married." Ryan's tone was calm, almost resigned. "It's what you signed." Her face went pale. "You're siding with him, aren't you? Your father." He sighed, setting his laptop aside. "Amelia," he told me once, "love doesn't erase boundaries. It just tests if you respect them." She laughed, harsh, incredulous. "Boundaries? You think that piece of paper gives him the right to control me?" Ryan stood up slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No. You gave him that right when you mocked the man who wrote it." She stared at him, stunned into silence. He left the room before she could respond. Harold didn't need to interfere. He just watched. The system he'd built did the work for him. Every clause was a mirror. Every signature, a promise that now reflected back the truth of her character. Weeks later, she arrived unannounced at Harold's small house, not in her usual heels and designer coat, but in panic. The doorbell rang twice. When Harold opened the door, her mask of confidence had already begun to crumble. Her eyes were red, her voice trembling. "Why?" she said. "Why did you do this?" He looked at her evenly. "Do what?" "You ruined me," she hissed. You set me up." He stepped aside calmly. "Come in." She entered, still shaking. The contrast between his small, neatly kept home and her hollow opulence hit her like a weight. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She did, reluctantly. Harold studied her for a long moment. The last time they had sat together, she'd mocked his furniture, called it antique by accident. Now, her manicured hands clutched the wooden arms as though the chair might disappear. "You think I ruined you," he said softly. "But I didn't write that contract to hurt you. I wrote it to reveal you." Her voice cracked. "I don't understand." "No," he said. "You don't listen." He stood and walked to the small cabinet by the wall, pulling out a single photograph. It was old, faded, his wife standing beside him on their porch, their son barely 5 years old between them. "She taught me something," Harold said quietly. "Never mistake silence for weakness. And never confuse kindness with permission." He placed the photo on the table between them. "You mocked me in front of strangers. You humiliated me at my son's wedding. And the man who should have defended me, the boy I raised, couldn't find the strength to speak. So I gave him something stronger than words." Her eyes filled with tears. You're a monster." He smiled faintly. "No. I'm a teacher." That night, she went home broken. The empire she thought she'd married into was now a cage she couldn't escape from. Her father tried to intervene, lawyers, threats, even blackmail attempts. But Harold had expected that too. The prenup's jurisdiction clause ensured that every legal challenge would fall under Harold's chosen attorney and court system, one he'd used for decades, one that favored precision over pity. Her father's bluster met nothing but the calm weight of Harold's foresight. When their family's attorney called Harold to negotiate revisions, he simply replied, "The ink's dry." In the months that followed, something unexpected began to happen. Ryan changed. Slowly, subtly. Without his wife's constant derision, he began visiting his father again. Sometimes for coffee. Sometimes for advice. Sometimes just to sit in the silence of a home that didn't pretend to be perfect. Was it worth it? Ryan asked one afternoon. Harold didn't look up from the wooden box he was carving, a gift for his late wife's grave. What? The prenup. The control. All this. Harold paused. Control isn't what I wanted. Clarity is. I gave her the chance to show what kind of person she really was. She just didn't like what she saw. Ryan was quiet for a long time. She's leaving. Harold nodded. I know. You're not happy about that. Harold sighed. I'm not happy about any of it. But sometimes, son, peace comes with a price. When the divorce papers came, Harold didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply filed them away, another form of closure written in ink. The trust remained intact, for his son and any future grandchildren. Amelia left with nothing but her name. Her father raged, threatening lawsuits and smear campaigns, but the contract stood like stone. Not a word could be overturned. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Harold sat in his workshop, the scent of sawdust thick in the air. He looked at the carved box, now finished, smooth, simple, perfect. On the lid, he had etched a single line of text. For every word unspoken, a consequence awaits. He closed the box gently, his expression unreadable. Revenge had never been his goal. Balance had. And balance, finally, had been restored. But even then, a quiet thought lingered, not of anger, not of regret, but of legacy. He wondered what his son had truly learned through all this. Because revenge was never the lesson. It was understanding. The kind that comes only after silence has done its work. The truth has a strange way of waiting. It doesn't rush, it doesn't rage. It lingers, patient and invisible, until the moment the world is quiet enough to hear it. For Harold, that moment came 1 year later. The same people who had once toasted him as a simple old man were gathering again. Same glittering hall, same expensive champagne, same obsession with appearances. But this time, it wasn't a wedding. It was an anniversary celebration, for Ryan and Amelia. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks earlier, printed on paper so thick it felt like arrogance pressed into cardstock. He hadn't expected one. And truthfully, he almost didn't go. Almost. Because revenge, true revenge, doesn't live in anger. It lives in timing. When Harold arrived, the hall was already glowing with the kind of grandeur only insecurity can afford. Gold-trimmed drapes, crystal chandeliers, a stage lined with white roses. Cameras flashed as Amelia posed for photos, radiant in a new designer gown. She looked happy, the kind of happiness that feeds off performance. Her father stood nearby, laughing too loud, slapping shoulders as if the past year had been erased. Ryan was there too, smiling mechanically, the fatigue in his eyes visible to anyone who looked long enough. When he spotted his father, he froze. "Dad," he said quietly, walking over. "You came." Harold gave a small nod. "You invited me." Ryan hesitated. "I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't." "Then why?" Harold's gaze was steady. "To finish something." Dinner was served beneath chandeliers that dripped with light. Speeches began, predictable, empty words about love, growth, and new beginnings. When it was Amelia's turn, she stood tall, glass in hand, voice dripping with charisma. "I want to thank everyone who stood by us this past year," she said. "Marriage isn't easy, but we've learned what it takes to make it work: trust, patience, and forgiveness." She glanced toward Harold, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And, of course," she continued, "family support. Ryan's father has been such a guiding force." The guests chuckled politely. Harold didn't. He sat quietly, his expression unreadable, while Amelia basked in her own applause. When the music resumed, she glided across the room, surrounded by people eager to be near her light. But beneath the polish, there was a flicker of something else, attention. Because the truth she had ignored for a year was finally tightening its grip. Harold had made sure of that. A week before the event, through channels that required no words, he'd ensured that her father's company, the one she so proudly tied her image to, received a letter. A simple, unassuming letter from his lawyer. It wasn't a threat. It was a notice. Her father's firm had been using funds transferred illegally from the joint marital accounts. And because those accounts were locked under the prenup's restrictions, every dollar spent could be traced back to unauthorized access. The penalty? Forfeiture of the funds. Publicly. The irony was exquisite. Her father's arrogance had been her undoing, again. So when Amelia raised her glass that night, smiling at the cameras, she had no idea that the world she had built was already fracturing beneath her. It began with a vibration. Her father's phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. Another buzz. Another. His eyes flicked to hers across the room. Something passed between them, confusion, then dread. He stood abruptly, muttering an excuse to the guests near him, and slipped out the side door, phone pressed to his ear. Amelia's smile faltered. Moments later, she received a message of her own. One look at the subject line, urgent, contract breach confirmation, and the color drained from her face. She set her glass down, her hands trembling. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she scrolled. Paragraphs of legal text blurred together, but the message was clear. Due to evidence of unauthorized fund transfers, the trust linked to your marital account is now under legal review. Assets frozen pending investigation. It was signed by her husband's lawyer. Harold's lawyer. The room tilted. Her father re-entered the hall, pale and shaking. He whispered something to her, words no one else heard, but everyone felt in the sudden stiffness of her posture. Then, silence. And that was when Harold stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't command attention. It found him naturally, as though the air itself knew who truly held the power in that room. "I suppose this is as good a time as any," he said softly, his tone cutting through the murmurs. "Since we're all celebrating transparency." Amelia's eyes darted toward him, wide, pleading. He stepped forward slowly, every word deliberate, measured. "You spoke of forgiveness, Amelia. Of patience. But there's another word you should have mentioned." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "Accountability." The word landed like a blade. Whispers rippled through the guests. Cameras turned. Her father's jaw clenched. Harold continued, his voice calm and heavy with authority. "When my son married you, I believed in the sanctity of family, in trust. You didn't. You believed in image. In manipulation. In control." He looked at Ryan, whose eyes were glassy, torn between relief and regret. "So I gave you both a test," Harold said. "A contract written not for money, but for truth." Amelia rose to her feet. "Stop." "He didn't. You mocked me in front of hundreds," he said quietly. "Treated me like a burden. Called me nothing. And yet the nothing man wrote the paper that built your entire fortune, and now, the same paper that ends it." Gasps. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amelia's father tried to interject, his voice booming, "You can't prove." "Oh, I can," Harold said, turning to him with a faint, razor-edged smile. "You signed it." The room fell still again. Harold reached into his coat pocket and produced a single envelope. He placed it on the table nearest him, the same kind of table she had once used to humiliate him. "It's all there," he said. "The transfers. The signatures. The evidence. And tomorrow morning, it'll be at your firm's headquarters and the finance bureau." Amelia's voice broke. Why are you doing this?" "Because," Harold said softly, "you needed to learn that respect can't be bought. It's earned. And you had every chance to earn it." Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. Ryan stood slowly, torn between disbelief and awakening. "Dad." Harold turned to him, his tone softening. "This isn't to destroy you, son. It's to save you from the people who already tried." Amelia sank into her chair, the weight of her choices crashing down all at once. And Harold, quiet, unshaken, simply buttoned his coat. "I won't see you again," he said. "But you'll remember me every time you sign your name on something you don't understand." He turned to leave. No applause. No confrontation. Just silence, the kind that follows truth after it's spoken aloud. Outside, the night was crisp. The cold air bit against his skin as he walked to his car, the muffled sounds of chaos still echoing faintly from the hall behind him. Ryan caught up to him halfway down the steps. "Dad," he said, breathless. "You could have ruined her completely." "I did," Harold said quietly. "Just not the way you think." Ryan frowned. "You mean legally?" Harold shook his head. "No. She'll live with the knowledge of what she lost. That's a heavier punishment than poverty." They stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Ryan asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me," Harold said. "Not until she proved it herself." Ryan nodded slowly. "You were right." "No," Harold murmured, looking up at the distant stars. "I was prepared. That's all." By morning, the story was everywhere. Financial news outlets, social media, legal circles, all buzzing with whispers of the frozen fortune scandal. Amelia's father stepped down from his firm. Her name, once gilded, was now synonymous with downfall. She stayed out of sight for weeks. Ryan moved out, and Harold went back to his quiet home, to the chair by the window, the same one where it had all begun. The light fell across his desk, illuminating the edges of the old Prenup folder. He picked it up one last time, ran his fingers over the embossed seal, and smiled faintly. He hadn't sought power. Only peace. And peace, like revenge, demanded patience. In the end, the worthless old man had written not just a contract, but a story. One that began with arrogance and ended with understanding. Because in the world of pride and betrayal, silence isn't weakness. It's the weapon of those who've already won. The world forgets quickly. Scandals burn hot, then fade into ash, leaving only the quiet smoke of memory. But for Harold, some fires never went out, they just settled deeper, glowing steady beneath the surface of his calm. Months had passed since that night. The headlines had gone quiet. The lawyers had finished their work. The money had been reallocated, the trust secured, and the house, the grand house that once echoed with mockery, sold to pay legal debts. Amelia vanished from the public eye. Her father's firm dissolved within a year. Ryan, for the first time in his adult life, began to live without noise. He found a smaller apartment, cooked his own dinners, visited his father every Sunday. The silence between them, once cold, had become warm again. And yet, for all the peace Harold found in those mornings, a shadow still lingered. The faint ache of knowing how deeply humiliation had to run before truth could rise. One Sunday afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the porch, Ryan arrived early. He looked different now, leaner, quieter, older somehow. There was no designer suit, no phone buzzing in his pocket. Just a man with a second chance and the humility to value it. They sat outside for a long while, sipping coffee, the kind of silence between them that didn't need filling. Finally, Ryan spoke. "She reached out." Harold didn't look up. "Amelia?" He nodded. "She sent a letter. No threats. No lawyers. Just words." "Read it." Ryan unfolded a piece of cream paper from his jacket. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the ghosts of love gone wrong. "Ryan, you don't owe me forgiveness, and I don't expect it. I used to think I was strong, that power came from control, from always being the one above. But I was wrong. I see now that I didn't love you. I loved what you represented, safety, validation, escape. And I destroyed it because I never understood respect, not for you, not for your father, not for myself. Your father didn't ruin me. He saved me from becoming something even worse. I see that now. I hope someday you can too. Amelia." Ryan folded the letter carefully, setting it on the table between them. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Harold's eyes stayed on the horizon. "I think people don't change because they're punished. They change because they're broken, and they choose what to build from the pieces." Ryan nodded slowly. "She asked if she could see you." Harold turned his head then, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "And what did you say?" "I told her I'd ask." For the first time in a long while, Harold leaned back and let the thought linger. He imagined her face, proud, furious, young. Then, humiliated, terrified, exposed. And now, maybe older, maybe quieter, maybe different. "Tell her to come," he said finally. Ryan blinked. "You mean it?" Harold nodded. "Let's see what kind of woman she became when the noise stopped." She arrived 3 days later. No driver, no entourage, no glittering rings. Just a woman in a plain coat, carrying a single envelope in her hand. When she stepped onto his porch, she hesitated before knocking, as though even the sound might break something sacred. Harold opened the door before she could. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. He wasn't the frail old man she'd once mocked. He stood tall, steady, eyes calm. The kind of calm that came from having seen everything, survived everything, and forgiven nothing he didn't need to. "Amelia," he said softly. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, her voice trembling. "Thank you for seeing me. Come in." The house was quiet, simple, warm. She glanced around, taking in the hand-carved furniture, the framed photographs, the faint smell of wood oil and coffee. It was everything she'd once dismissed as quaint, and now it felt like something she'd never had, peace. She sat at the table across from him, the same spot where she'd once thrown accusations like daggers. "I didn't come to apologize," she began. "Not because I don't mean it, but because I know it doesn't matter anymore. You don't need my apology." Harold studied her face. There were new lines there, not of age, but of understanding. "Then why did you come?" he asked quietly. She swallowed. "To thank you." He tilted his head. "For ruining your life." "For saving it," she said softly. "You could have destroyed me completely. You didn't. You gave me the chance to start over. And I did." He said nothing, but she continued. "I work at a non-profit now. Legal aid for women who've been trapped in bad marriages or abusive contracts. The irony isn't lost on me." She gave a faint, almost shy smile. "Your contract taught me how to write better ones." Harold's eyes softened, though his tone stayed firm. "What made you change?" "The silence," she said. "After everything collapsed, the house, the money, my reputation, there was nothing left but quiet. And in that quiet, I started hearing myself. The real me. The one I buried under arrogance." He nodded slowly. "That's where all truths live. In the silence." They sat for a long time after that, the air heavy but not hostile. Finally, Amelia slid the envelope across the table. "This is for you." He opened it and found a simple check, not for a grand amount, but symbolic. "I can't undo what I said," she said quietly, "but I wanted to return something. Not because I owe it, but because I understand now what value really is." Harold placed the check on the table, untouched. "Keep it." Her brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because forgiveness doesn't have a price," he said. "And redemption doesn't come with a receipt." Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "Do you forgive me?" she asked. Harold leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You don't need my forgiveness. You just need to live differently." She nodded slowly. "I already am." And then, for the first time since the day she'd mocked him at her wedding, Amelia Hayes, no longer a bride, no longer a villain, stood and extended her hand. He took it. Firm. Steady. Equal. When she left, the sun was setting, spilling gold across the old porch steps. Ryan appeared in the doorway, watching her walk away down the long dirt road. "You spoke to her?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "How was it?" Harold smiled faintly. "Necessary." Ryan nodded. "You're incredible, Dad." "No," Harold said softly. "Just patient." Weeks later, Harold visited his wife's grave. The air was cool, the earth soft beneath his shoes. He placed a small carved box, the one he'd made months earlier, beside her headstone. Inside was the original prenuptial contract, the paper that had begun everything. He rested his hand on the stone. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "He's safe now. And she's learned." The wind stirred gently through the grass, and for a moment he thought he could almost hear her voice, not words, just warmth. He closed his eyes, feeling the peace settle deep. Back home, he sat by the window again. The light was soft, the world quiet. Ryan's laughter drifted faintly from the kitchen as he burned another attempt at dinner. Harold smiled. There was no more bitterness. No more fire. Only stillness, the kind that comes after justice has done its work. He looked down at the old wedding photo on the table, his wife, his son, himself, and whispered, "Some lessons take years to bloom." Then he leaned back, eyes closing, and let the silence fill the room once more. Because revenge, when done right, doesn't leave destruction. It leaves understanding. And sometimes, understanding is the most haunting form of victory there is.